Before their Kurosawa-inspired epic, before the high-voltage tale of Cole McGrath, but after Rocket, whose single outing I'm sure you're all well versed in, there was Sly Cooper, Sucker Punch's most endearing creation. In this retrospective series, I will be examining the full works that make up the Sly Pantheon. The focus will primarily be on how each game evolves from the titles that precede it, in addition to exploring how the video game medium as a whole changes in between releases and how the games adapt to the times. As for this first episode, in lieu of evolutionary analysis, I will provide a brief history on Sucker Punch Productions and the inception of their most wanted mammal. Please note that the game footage you will see in this video was taken from an emulated version of the PS2 game, upscaled into 1080p and making use of a widescreen hack. I unfortunately do not have the means to obtain footage myself from consoles, so I do apologise about any graphical anomalies that you may see. I will amend this in the near future, so hopefully upcoming videos in this series will feature recordings from the PS3 HD collection, which, due to some janky porting, will come complete with its own set of graphical anomalies. Much of the historical information I'm about to provide comes thanks to a piece by Colin Moriarty of IGN. Sucker Punch Productions was formed by a group of Microsoft employees during the late 90s, with the three key players being Brian Fleming, Bruce Oberg, and Chris Zimmerman. They had become disenfranchised with their work, in particular with how Microsoft's rise to a global superpower in the computing world caused the size of the teams they worked with to considerably inflate. They wished to return to a simpler time of working in smaller groups where they could be more hands-on with every part of the creative process. It was this yearning that led to the formation of Sucker Punch, with the goal of creating a video game, despite the fact that between them they had very little experience in game development. This didn't deter the slowly expanding Troop Zone, who were determined to make this venture work, fueled by their passion of video games that was nurtured by time spent in the arcades and playing on home computers in their formative years. The group decided that the Nintendo 64 was to be their platform of choice, simply due to there being less games for it available than on the PC or PlayStation, so they deduced that their creation would have a greater chance of standing out by placing it within a much smaller crowd. They knocked on Nintendo's door and asked for some dev kits, which they were refused. Although Nintendo did extend the courtesy of letting them know that if they could develop a prototype, without their development tools, and pitched it to them, them being a company who weren't going to publish the game, then they would be allowed to purchase the necessary apparatus to create games for their console. So that's what Sucker Punch did. This led to the creation of Rocket, Robot on Wheels, whom Sucker Punch would find a publisher for in Ubisoft. While Rocket was no great success, it reviewed favourably, and many of the people who had joined Sucker Punch after their genesis and worked on the game would stay aboard and form much of Sly Cooper's staff. Of particular note was Nate Fox, who in an interview with Engadget stated, "Because of the success of the design I had done with Rocket, I got promoted for Sly Cooper and did half of the design of the game." With the design on Rocket he was referring to being environmental art and lighting. As for how Sucker Punch became an exclusive developer Sony, with the conglomerate eventually purchasing them outright, this too dates back to Rocket's development. In a rather ballsy move, Sucker Punch pitched their demo to Sony, in the hopes that they would be able to create a PlayStation port. Their pitch was unsuccessful, with the principal reason being that Sony were vehemently against publishing a game that was also on their competitor's system. This isn't to say that Sony weren't impressed with what they had been presented though. Producer Grady Hunt, who is in attendance for this pitch, has said, "They had this very cartoony game, but they had real physics in it. It looked and felt very different. I think one of the things, at least to me, that made Sucker Punch feel special compared to other teams, although they were really inexperienced at that time, was that they had a lot of creativity on the programming side." Sony evidently committed this brief encounter to memory, and expressed an interest in publishing the company's second title early on. Fleming has explained that he noticed how platformers that would become iconic had always been published by the company who produced the console, This observation factored heavily into the company's decision to partnering with Sony. So, it would be for the PlayStation 2 that Sucker Punch's new hero would call home, with Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus, or simply Sly Raccoon if you're from my part of the world, initially releasing on September 23rd, 2002. If you're curious as to why a raccoon was selected, the sight gag of a raccoon putting on a mask somehow seemed super funny to us. While the choice of animal may have come from this simple joke, the inspirations that would eventually help the game as a whole take shape are far more intriguing. If you were to look at a picture of Sly, with no prior knowledge of the character, you'd be pardoned in assuming that he was of comic book origin. The thick ink-black outline, sharp angular design, and bold colour scheme are all trademarks of the comic book aesthetic that Sucker Punch wanted their new hero to be presented in. To help make the transition of this design from ink and paper to PlayStation 2, Sly Raccoon makes use of cel shading, which at the time was a recent development in graphical rendering for video games. Popularised by Sega's Jet Set Radio a couple of years prior, this technique allows for 3D rendered graphics to appear more flat. The advantage of this was that it helped mask out some of the roughness caused by polygons, whilst also allowing for a gallant comic book style presentation. Being a game that leans heavily on stealth and has the user exploiting shadows to gain an advantage, Sly 1 employs darker tones than many of its cel-shaded contemporaries. These exaggerated shadows, in conjunction with the game's crime-centric tale, demonstrates how film noir was a key influence. This style of filmmaking, popularised in the 1940s and 50s, is highly recognisable with such elements as cynical protagonists, stylised visuals featuring low-key lighting, and portraying disenchanted worlds overrun by lawlessness.
For Mr. Brown, I'd snatch a judge from a superior court for a chocolate soda.
Throughout Sly, we get a sense that the world these characters inhabit is one of felony and corruption, with there being only one character who exists on the side of good, Detective Carmelita Fox. Despite being based out of Paris, pursuing Sly forces her to track his activities around the entire globe, with seemingly no borders on her jurisdiction. The opening mission in central Paris, a highly populated city and only residential locale of the game, shows the streets as being completely vacated at night, with the only signs of life in the 7th arrondissement being the lights emanating through closed windows. This brief glance into the state of Sly's world gives a sense that law and order is out of control. Organised crime runs rampant, with the police and other law enforcement agencies seemingly powerless to stop them. Even the members of the Fiendish Five can only be incarcerated after Sly has dismantled their operations. These influences are all reinforced by the more muted tones that the artists at Sucker Punch selected when creating this world. It's not just in the visual design that comic book influences can be found. It permeates almost all the game's facets in a meaningful way that shows great craftsmanship and passion from the developers. The opening cutscenes that occur after the short introductory gameplay sequence relay an exposition-heavy origin story, a trope commonly found within superhero works that effectively, if a bit bluntly, establishes the characters, their goals and motivations. The premise is a basic one. Sly's parents were murdered when he was a kid, and the family heirloom, an encyclopedic book titled The Thievius Raccoonus, was stolen. This book contains the history of Sly's lineage, chronicling his ancestors' escapades, as well as being an instructional work on how to perform the moves and skills necessary to become a master thief. Those responsible for its theft, a collective known as the Fiendish Five, split the tone between them, and Sly, aided by childhood friends Bentley and Murray, are on a mission to recover the book, and avenge his parents' demise in the process. While the plot may be a familiar one, that isn't necessarily a poor choice when it comes to the first title in what was obviously an attempt to kickstart a franchise. Sucker Punch's decision to ally themselves exclusively with Sony, and with Fleming's words about iconic platformers in mind, shows a commitment to a long-term investment in the Sly brand right from the outset. So while the story may lack originality, this does allow the game to focus on establishing Sly's character traits and enables audiences to familiarise themselves with him, facilitating more nuanced scenarios in the future. Look at the strategy that Marvel employed when constructing their cinematic universe. The introductory film for each character featured a rather by-the-numbers plot, with a great deal of time spent on exemplifying the protagonist's more distinctive characteristics. Then, only in the sequels and ensemble films was more creative freedom granted to the plot. So while the original Captain America or Thor may be rather weak as individual films, Avengers wouldn't have worked without the groundwork they laid. So the logic behind Sly's stock narrative is sound, providing that subsequent games successfully capitalise on it.
So what are we waiting for? You show me those.
Sly Raccoon makes use of serialization in regards to how it structures the story as it progresses. While the game can be broken up into 5 areas, or worlds to use more video game appropriate terminology, each one is presented as its own short story, complete with opening cutscene and unique title, whilst remaining a part of the single larger narrative at play. Each story is set within a specific location, based on real-world environments, ranging from Wales to China. The reasoning behind the locations is that they house the base of operations for a member of the Fiendish Five. I like how this format provides reasonable explanation as to why you venture to each location. The villains aren't just hanging out in these places waiting for you to sneak in, they're actively working upon their criminal intentions. You're not just in the jungles of Haiti because that's a cool location, it's because it's where Miss Ruby is using voodoo magic to manufacture an army of ghosts. China isn't just there because it's time for some snow levels, it's where the Panda King has established his explosive production plants and is extorting money from villagers by offering insurance, in addition to storing those all-important pages in the Thievius Raccoonus. This same philosophy of justifying each locale's usage is also the driving force behind level compositions. Although the goal of each level is to acquire the treasure key needed to access the boss fight, the setting also tells a story of how the villains are going about enacting their nefarious plans. For instance, when you get to the Isle of Wrath in the Welsh Triangle, you discover that Fiendish Five-member Raleigh has developed a storm machine capable of generating fierce weather systems that can sink ships. So, the levels in the area include an engine room, which is what powers the storm machine, as well as a ship graveyard, giving you a sense of the devastation he's caused. What Sucker Punch have achieved here is allowing the levels and their environments to be the storyteller, rather than using extensive cutscenes and dialogue sequences. This gives stages a more realised and fleshed out story than many other games in the genre, without having to directly communicate to the player, instead letting them uncover and explore the story for themselves through play. This results in a much smoother experience that doesn't constantly interrupt you with cutscenes when you want nothing more than to actually play the game. This globe-trotting tale, along with the pre-opening cutscene tutorial section, also demonstrates one of the game's other inspirations, James Bond. One of the defining traits of a Bond film is the opening act, usually taking place in an exotic location. These action-heavy sequences immediately hook the viewer, before slowing everything down for a while when it's time to focus on narrative and character development. The ebb and flow of Sly 1 matches that, with the exciting lead-off where you break into Detective Carmelita Fox's office, followed by a frantic chase scene, before taking a breather to then introduce Sly and the gang. This type of pacing is maintained throughout the game, as after the climactic battle against a Fiendish Five member, you can't just immediately rush into the next zone without letting the game establish that new location and the situation taking place there. These moments of respite are an important tool, as it gives the player a moment to digest the events that have transpired, then provides a setup for the next act, and not force them immediately back into the fray. It also means that once the action gets going again, it doesn't need to let up for any extended period of time until the fall of the next boss. These inspirations don't just help the game's story and structure take shape, but also Sly as a character. Sly Cooper is a thief, a raccoon who chooses to break the law. So why should we like him? Why should we want to be a part of his adventure? First of all, a larcener he may be, but he is also a being of honour, staunch in his belief that you should only steal from those whom have amassed riches for themselves through the misfortune of others. His ethics are very much in the same vein as Robin Hood, but it's his charm and charisma that make him so endearing. Sly is not a white meat babyface. He has an edge that gives him a different kind of appeal to a character like Mario. I wouldn't go so far as to deem him an anti-hero. He's not a Deadpool or Rorschach by any means, but Sly is also a character aimed at a much younger audience than those creations. He is unflinching in his quest for revenge though, and has no compunctions about engaging the Fiendish Five and avenging his parents. Again, being that this is a game given a 3+ rating, he's not out murdering everyone in cold blood. But Sly doesn't struggle with any sort of moral dilemma about his lifestyle. Ian Fleming's Bond, again, can be seen in Sly with his calm demeanour and quick-wittedness when it comes to verbal sparring sessions, although, due to the side of the law in which he operates, Danny Ocean may be a better comparison in this regard.
You're not going to get any younger hanging around here. What do you want?
Interesting.
Like all the best fictional characters, Sly has his limitations, which is why he can't be a one-man operation. Bentley serves as the brains of the troupe, not only due to his intellect, but also with his CSI-level keyboard hacking proficiency. Bentley's role in the story may be to act as the voice of concern, playing the foil to counteract Sly's fearlessness, but this also allows for Cooper's flaws to be exposed. Late in the game, Sly attempts to rescue a subdued Carmelita, going against the advice of Bentley, who is fully aware that the situation is a trap. Sly's unwillingness to flinch on his principles lead to his being trapped as well, and Bentley is the one who must come to the rescue. Demonstrating Sly's shortcomings in this way is another example of how the character is made appealing to the audience. We might not all be able to relate to having our parents murdered at a young age, or having to grow up in an orphanage, but we've all made mistakes, and we all have weaknesses. This is the key to making Sly, a character who could have easily suffered a great disconnect with the audience, work so well. I'll go into further detail on Bentley and Murray in future games, as Sly One's focus when it comes to character development is clearly all about the star. Bentley gets the one arc I've just outlined, where he must save Sly despite his resignations about helping Carmelita. Murray really doesn't get jack though. He's the clumsy comedic relief, and it doesn't help his cause that all of his levels involving him are some of the weakest moments of the game. The only other character that I feel is worth mentioning for now is Clockwork, head of the Fiendish Five and the game's final boss. The other antagonists don't amount to much more than being histrionic caricatures of various stereotypes, whereas Clockwork, with his mechanical voice and revelation of his shadowy omnipresence having hunted Sly's family for hundreds of years, makes for a genuinely unsettling creature. While Sly is able to quip and joke about the other villains to rile them up, that weapon is nullified against this callous, artificial, ageless being. The fact that you aren't provided with any sort of background information or origin story regarding Clockwork intensifies his mystique. He seems to go against the laws of the world established within the game. Despite his existence spanning centuries, he is comprised of an incredibly advanced mechanical body. How is he able to take such a form? How has he managed to operate for generations without anyone gaining knowledge of his existence? He's a character that encourages the players to ask questions about, but without any definitive answers, you have to draw your own conclusions, making Clockwork as enigmatic and interesting as you want him to be. Sly Raccoon is often classified as a stealth platformer, but I think giving those two words equal billing is something of a misnomer. Playing through Sly, it is clearly a 3D platformer, one that places a much greater emphasis on stealth than other works in the genre, but still a 3D platformer first and foremost. I say this because I found that the skills needed to succeed in a platformer were put to test much more frequently and with greater intensity, although it's the covert sections that I found to be the more worthy of discussion, owing to their distinctiveness when the game is compared with its peers. The rooftop, where you first have control over Sly, makes for a nice little playground, granting you an opportunity to become accustomed to the controls and camera. You can freely move and jump about this space, and it also lets you discover that swinging your cane destroys certain objects. I like how this lets the player get to grips with the controls by themselves, rather than through tutorials. The first obstacle in your path, however, does contain a pet peeve of mine. All of Sly's essential sneaking maneuvers are set to the circle button, and you're given this information through dialogue between Sly and Bentley. I mentioned in my Shantae videos how I didn't like the skull icons indicating bottomless pits because they existed solely to instruct the player, but didn't actually belong in the world. Sly nearly makes the same mistake with the indicator telling you that you're able to sneak around an object, but at least provides you with an explanation as to what that indicator is and why Sly can see it. It may be simple, but it works for me. What does break immersion though, is voiced dialogue telling you to press the circle button. I always prefer instructions like this to be displayed through a text box, and to leave the character interactions for narrative progression. Breaking the fourth wall is fine, just not 30 seconds into the game before the 4 walls can even be built. As I mentioned, all of Sly's essential talents are designated to the circle button, which does make the stealth action more streamlined. Jumping to and from thin poles and sliding down mossy branches can be performed with the ease of a single button press. What works best about this system is how forgiving the game is in terms of understanding what it is you're trying to do. By that, I mean if you want to jump on top of a narrow pole, that might look like it would require exceptional precision, but as long as you get near the pole and press circle, the game will take over and ensure that you make a safe landing. This means that the game can present challenges that look like they would require immense accuracy, but in actuality, any player can perform these impressive feats with a single button press. Movement and performing actions may feel a bit slow at first, practically sluggish even, but it doesn't take long to come to terms with this more deliberate approach to platform gameplay, which makes sense in the context of who Sly is. You may not be able to get about as quickly as a character like Ratchet, but you're also not decked out with an arsenal of destructive firearms. Sly as a character needs to be precise and calculated with his actions, otherwise he would make for a totally ineffective thief. The developers managed to convey this to the player through the slower paced gameplay. Sly gives you plenty of time and space to plan each move you want to make, but it also forces you to commit to those actions. If you want to slink past a guard when they're not looking, you are nearly always in a position to assess the situation before making a move. But if you start to act, then try to back out, you will certainly be detected. Also tying into this idea of making the player commit to their moves is Sly's fragility as a character. He's only able to take a single hit, and doing so will send him back to the previous checkpoint. He's able to withstand additional punishment if the player acquires a Lucky Charm horseshoe, either by collecting 100 coins or just finding one in the wild. One of the main criticisms of Sly upon release was that it's too easy of a game, which I must concur with, and I think that the Lucky Charms play a factor into this. Furthermore, even if you are detected, by no means are you guaranteed to be killed, going back to my saying that this is a platformer first. Armed with his cane, Sly can not only use this to clear debris and swing from hooks, but also to dispatch of various enemies. Getting an unfavourable situation under control is very easily done, with the ability to double jump, dodging an enemy's attack and delivering a counterblow becomes second nature by the end of the game. While the action may feel a bit clumsy at times, the ease of which you can dispose of enemies regardless of whether they have detected you does considerably undermine the need to utilise your bandit heritage. The challenge of the game would have been considerably increased if there was greater consequences for failing to stay hidden, and it would have also allowed the well-designed stealth mechanics to play a more integral role in the game. The boss fights are what truly prove that stealth is only a secondary factor in Sly, as they completely forego utilising the element of surprise in favour of focusing on dodging the boss's attacks until they leave an opening for you to go swinging in with your cane. It should be said that some bosses, such as Mugshot and Clockwork, do necessitate the use of the various skills that Sly learns in order to overcome. They actually make sure that the player has mastered the various techniques found within the Thievius Raccoonus, and forces you to apply what you've learned and put those skills into practice. However, the Panda King, for instance, can easily be dealt with by running and jumping around in a circle, followed by a not-so-skillful mashing of the attack button when he leaves himself vulnerable. It's a shame, because the boss fights should have incorporated the ever-growing culmination of Sly's abilities, and incorporated them in as challenging a way as possible so that the player can demonstrate that they're ready to receive the next ability and add that to Sly's repertoire. The Ms. Ruby boss fight was of particular disappointment to me for this reason. The series of levels preceding her had a focus on running across and sliding down branches, which made for some great action sequences. However, the boss eschews using any of this in favour of a rhythm game, making the work put into conquering all the levels in the area feel inconsequential as a result. What would a late 90s and new millennium 3D platformer be without collectibles? Not Sly Raccoon, that's for sure. I've already mentioned the coins that transform into a Lucky Charm upon the 100th being collected. More interestingly though are the clue bottles scattered about the levels. Each level contains a safe, and in order to access its contents, all clue bottles in the corresponding area must be procured. The majority of rewards for completing this task is an additional page of the Thievius Raccoonus, granting Sly skills that aren't imperative in completing his quest, but will facilitate an easier time henceforth. These optional skills are all set to one button like their mandatory counterparts, and can be cycled through to the desired one. The most useful of these enhancements to Sly's capabilities are those that prevent him from losing a life or charm when falling into bottomless pits or bodies of water, but do have a drawback in making a game already lacking challenge even easier. I also dislike how the ability to perform a basic forward roll isn't something that can be performed at any time, and I feel that it should have been designated its own unique button on the controller, as I found myself never using it in favour of having the dive skill selected for the majority of the game. What I do like about these optional collectibles as compared to their equivalents in other games is that they provide a use throughout the adventure. Take the gems from Crash for example. Destroy all boxes in a level and you're rewarded with a gem, a prize that doesn't actually have any effect unless you collect all the gems in the entire game. This means that if you haven't gathered the complete set of gems, you might as well have none at all, whereas even if you only collect the clue bottles in half of the levels they can be found in, you're still going to receive some substantial rewards for your efforts. Providing an incentive to poke and prod round every corner of a level is a good way to force players to engage fully with your level design, and really take in all of what that location has to offer, rather than dashing through it as fast as possible. Speaking of dashing through a level, there are also the Master Thief sprints that are available to successful Petermen. Now, while these time trials are the one aspect of the game I'll admit I didn't partake in, the rewards for these are developer commentaries, which is a brilliant idea. Completing the time trials is a task that's only going to be undertaken by those who truly love the game, and I think having the opportunity to hear Sucker Punch's staff explain the thought process behind each level is a great reward for the most dedicated and skilled players. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the other forms of gameplay on offer in Sly Raccoon. In addition to your regularly scheduled platforming, levels that feature twin-stick shooting, racing, and turrets all make an appearance. And all of these suck. The twin-stick shooting is slow and lacks the kinds of features and fluidity that makes games in that genre work so well. The driving is clumsy, amounting to no more than controlling a van with a single analog stick, and on occasion activating a boost. The turret levels are turret levels. Point, shoot, and do your best not to hit Murray. I would say that these stages can be disregarded if they only appeared once each, but they instead make up 12 of the 35 levels. While I understand the desire to diversify game elements to prevent others from going stale, these levels add nothing to the game as a whole, and feel so perfunctory in their design when compared to the finely crafted platforming stages. I never liked the flying stages in the original Spyro either, but at least there was only one of them per world. Furthermore, because that was the only single alternative gameplay style in Spyro, Insomniac were at least able to build up the challenge of the aerial levels throughout the game, and also made for a better thematic fit with Spyro's world, as opposed to whacking chickens with your cane. If Sucker Punch had focused in on a single one of these game styles, and fleshed it out throughout the adventure, it could have worked out so much better, rather than this quantity over quality approach that was taken.
Once I catch you, you'll know.
The only level that deviates from the norm and still works is those involving Carmelita. In these missions, you have to reach the treasure key as normal, but with the addition of having Detective Fox constantly trying to take you down. These levels force the player to be more proactive than with the stealth-focused levels, and maintain constant movement throughout, as remaining stationary for too long here will ensure that you receive a direct hit from Carmelita's comically oversized pistol. This kind of variance in gameplay works much better, as it still requires you to make use of the skills and techniques you've been developing during the course of the game, but the challenge takes a different form. In taking away the time you normally have to think and strategize, you're forced to act more instinctively, and react to each obstacle as it comes without hesitation. The layout and flow of these stages has been altered accordingly, consisting of narrower passages which ensure that you're always headed in the right direction. There's also less of a focus on combat and dealing with enemies, with the challenge usually coming from platforming sections that need to be traversed efficiently and with dexterousness. These levels also allow the game to best show off its capabilities for environmental destruction. Even if you are able to dodge Carmelita's shots, her attacks will inexorably cause the ground beneath you to collapse, forcing you to press on without a moment's respite.
I've hunted you for years, tried to throw you behind bars, but when you get a chance to leave me in a cage, you set me free. Why?
Sly Raccoon was a financial success for Sucker Punch, despite its release suffering from being sandwiched between two other newly created franchises that were all vying for the same piece of the platforming pie. Naughty Dog and Insomniac were looking to follow up on the tremendous success they had on the original PlayStation with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon respectively. To do this, they both started developing new IPs that could feature gameplay that they felt was better suited to the PlayStation 2 and the more powerful hardware it contained. The result of this was Jak and Daxter, released in December 2001, and Ratchet & Clank, released November 2002, just 2 months after Sly. These games were both vast in scale, and made for great technical showcases of what the next generation of consoles would be capable of. The immensity of these games, and the pedigree of the developers behind them, meant that the majority of consumers in the market for a new platformer would be more likely to part with their money on one or both of these games before Sly. There was also, of course, the new Crash and Spyro games as well. While these may have both been weaker entries than their PS1 outings due to being created by less capable developers, they still had a significant name value and a large pre-existing fanbase, compounding the issue for Sly of trying to generate a following of its own. Sly also came out at a time when the general interest in anthropomorphized animal platformers was starting to wane. Ever since the release of Sonic back in 1991, a whole swarm of derivative creature-based mascots sporting an attitude invaded the video game industry. This was a trend for pretty much the entirety of the 90s, but by the time that Sly was released, the bandwagon had slowed down somewhat due to the excessive number of passengers it was carrying. As photorealistic graphics were starting to become a reality, developers didn't need to rely on utilising animals and cartoonish art styles. They were able to create games featuring human characters with such graphical fidelity that they could display a variety of realistic facial expressions, and not just in FMV cutscenes. Of course, when looking back, a game like Sly with its cell shading has aged a lot better than works that opted for a more true-to-life aesthetic. But how the game would be viewed nearly 20 years later wasn't what was on people's minds at the time. Due to this, I feel that Sly may have suffered something from a crisis of identity as a game. It has the visuals and story of a game aimed at a much younger audience who are going to be more drawn into the notion of playing as a cartoon criminal raccoon. However, the more methodical gameplay that demands patience from its player and for them to consider their movements for a moment before taking action is something that would appeal to an older demographic. I'm not saying that Sucker Punch were wrong for this confluence of comic book inspired art and covert gameplay, but give most children the option between this or Ratchet, who is capable of blowing up swarms of aliens with his ridiculous arsenal of zany weaponry, and the Lombax is clearly going to be the more popular choice. While I'm sure there were many adults who did purchase a copy of Sly for themselves and found the excellence of the game contained within, it's just more likely that the audience for this genre would gravitate towards series like Metal Gear Solid or Tenchu first. To conclude, Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus is still just as brilliant a game now as it was when it was first released. The team at Sucker Punch managed to create a game that far exceeds what they should have been capable of, given the relative inexperience of some staff, and that it was only their second game as a company. While it may be the stealth-based gameplay that has been successfully fused with some very good 3D platform design that makes the game stand out among its peers, the endearing characters and comic book graphics go a long way in covering up some of the more prominent flaws the game has. For a debut outing, Sly gets it right in a lot of ways. A likeable cast of characters has been established, along with a unique world setting featuring a pronounced graphical styling that is filled with opportunity for expansion in the future. Obviously, there are some much weaker elements of the game, such as the poorly conceived non-platforming levels, lack of development for characters not named Sly, and the general absence of any difficulty and short length of the game. These issues are what I shall be paying particular attention to in the future to see if and how they are addressed. If you've never played a Sly game before, or just have memories of it from all those years ago, it's very easy for me to give a recommendation. Unfortunately, Sly hasn't been made available to purchase for some years now, leading to original copies of the game to start creeping up in price. The HD trilogy is also costly compared to the average value of PS3 games at this time, but still makes for a sound investment. Obviously, emulation is an option, and the route I had to take, but I understand that PS2 emulation is not something everyone can or wants to do. Do give this game a look, or perhaps a second look for many of you, however you can though. In the next episode of this series, I'll see how the middle child of the PS2 Sly trilogy fares. I hope you'll join me again, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video.